This Thursday sees the kickoff of the 2013 CFL season, where 8 teams will battle it out to try and get a shot at the 101st Grey Cup title. And joining me now to discuss the season ahead and I suppose the differences really between the CFL and the NCAA and NFL style of football that most of our readers are used to is Andrew Bucholtz, who's joining us from Vancouver, who of course writes for the 55-yard line on Yahoo Sports. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
No problem, Emmet. Thanks for having me.
I suppose, Andrew, well, first off now, I'm familiar enough with the game myself from my day job and various things, but just for people who don't understand, what are the fundamental differences for someone who's used to the NFL, NCAA? We see a lot of it on Sky and ESPN America over here. What would the basic differences be for people who aren't too familiar?
Well, it's fundamentally the same game, Canadian and American football. It's the same general principle of you march down the field, you try and score a touchdown or a field goal, right? But what is different is that it's a bigger field, for one. There are 12 men on each side instead of 11, which makes for quite a difference in terms of the plays, the routes, the coverage schemes, and that sort of thing. And perhaps most significantly, there are only 3 downs instead of 4. So that means that there's more of an emphasis on passing, there's more of an emphasis on gaining substantial amounts of yardage on every single play, and so that can make for a really high-scoring, exciting offensive game.
I suppose in terms of how that affects the running game, because obviously you're used to sort of trying, you got 3 to 10 yards, you've only got 2, so how do teams really deploy the running game? Is it different to how they'd use it in the 3-and-out version?
Yeah, it's quite different. The running game is still very important in the CFL, but it's handled differently from a sense of that a run is really only valuable in the CFL if you're gaining 5 yards or more. Because, of course, you've only got the 3 downs, and really that means that generally you want to try and get your yards on 1st and 2nd down, because on 3rd down and anything reasonably long, you're probably going to punt or kick a field goal. So it's very important that runs aren't called as a matter of course. It's not just it's 1st down, you're going to run the ball. That you mix them in as a bit more of a surprise element. And another thing that's different about the runs here is that often they're out of a single back set. There's no, rather than the conventional American football one, where you have a fullback as your lead blocker and then a running back taking the ball as a tailback. So a lot of the runs come out of the single back set. There's a lot of different option reads in particular too. So you'll have the quarterback take a snap, look and see if there's a hole for himself to run, if there's a hole for the running back, or if he should throw the ball. So a lot of the plays basically they're set up in a way that the quarterback will react to how the defense is lined up and what they're doing. Thus, running isn't as much a matter of course. You don't really see it's more of an alternative option, but it can still be a very valuable one.
And one of the other things I've noticed myself from watching, which people wouldn't be familiar with over here, is there's motion before the snap as well on the offensive side.
Yes, there is. That mainly comes from is a couple of the receivers. You've got what's known as a waggle, which is where the receivers start in motion. The waggle is a little deceptive because sometimes it actually is a waggle, sometimes it's them just running in a straight line up to the line of scrimmage. But what you usually see that with the inside receivers or the slot backs. And what makes that really interesting is, for one, it gives them a big advantage on sort of short routes over the middle, short passing plays and that, because they're already at full speed by the time they hit the line, whereas the defenders usually are starting in place. The other thing that makes the CFL game tricky with that waggle and with those players in motion is that your timing has to be absolutely on, because if your center holds on to the ball for too long, then all of a sudden you've got the guys in motion going offside. It requires very precise timing and coordination, and it's quite an adjustment for a lot of American players. And that's one of the interesting things is that a lot of the American receivers who come up here, some of them work their way in as slot backs, and we've had some very good American slot backs, but it's easier for them to adapt to the outside wide receiver slots. Usually there's a little less pre-snap motion there, and it's a little less of an adjustment.
So that's one of the things I've noticed though with
Mm-hmm.
typical CFL rosters is that, like, because there'd be an awful lot of guys who'd be sort of well-known NCAA players who don't make it to the NFL, but an awful lot of them don't make it up north either. Like, it seems to be often guys from smaller schools really making the difference, or guys who maybe wouldn't have been big stars. Is it? What do you think is the reason for that? I suppose, like, because obviously Ricky Ray jumps to mind for me. Like
Mm-hmm.
Sacramento State, I think he went to, wasn't it? And like you got a few others like that who, like, and obviously Anthony Calvillo, who came from pretty much nowhere to be a star in Canada.
Yeah, that's especially prominent amongst the quarterbacks. At some of the other positions, we've got bigger school guys who go on to be stars. But with quarterbacks, we've had a lot of big names, like, for example, Chris Leak, Colt Brennan, and Tate Forcier. A lot of these guys who were well-known NCAA players who haven't really made it in Canada, while smaller school guys like Ray and Calvillo have. I think what a big part of that comes down to is that the CFL game takes such an adjustment, especially for the quarterbacks, and that comes back to the 12-a-side I was talking about earlier, because that completely revolutionizes what routes you're going to run. It revolutionizes your whole route tree, and it revolutionizes what a defensive coverage looks like. Like, for example, I mean, the standard sort of setup in American football is going to be either a 4-3 defense, so with 4 down linemen, 3 linebackers, then 2 cornerbacks and 2 safeties, or 3-4, where you got 3 linemen, 4 linebackers, 2 cornerbacks, and 2 safeties. Well, the CFL is completely different. You usually, because for one, you've got that extra man, but also there's usually only sometimes there's 7 guys in that front, sometimes there's 6. So quite often you'll see something like 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, and then 6 defensive backs. So it really changes the coverage schemes. You often see teams playing with just a single safety and then a whole lot of cornerbacks and halfbacks. So there's a lot of adjusting that goes into it. You also have to get guys to really focus on accuracy more than necessarily big plays, because in a league where you only have 3 downs, you got to make every throw count a little more.
That's really bad for Tim Tebow.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's one of the reasons a lot of people are saying, no, the CFL will be great for Tim Tebow. But I think he would really be challenged up here, given his accuracy issues. The thing to keep in mind, too, is that these guys did not become CFL stars overnight. With Calvillo in particular, he was sort of thrown into the fire. He started with the Las Vegas Posse during the ill-fated U.S. expansion era. And he wasn't all... most quarterbacks don't start in their first year. He did, because that was a time when the league was really expanding and just pulling in players from wherever. But he started there. He wasn't very good. He went off to Hamilton and wasn't terribly good there either, and a lot of people were ready to give up on him. But eventually, he learned, he acclimatized to the game, and he came to Montreal, and he's become one of the most dominant CFL players ever. So I'd say generally it takes most players a while to adapt to the CFL, regardless of the position they play, but it takes even longer for quarterbacks. I think with some of the big NCAA guys, maybe they don't necessarily have as much of a willingness to really throw away what they've learned and work on learning a whole new game. Whereas the smaller school guys seem it hasn't maybe come as easy for them all of their lives, so they're perhaps a little more inclined to start over, to put in the work, to do what it's going to take to become a CFL star, rather than just take that for granted.
I suppose looking at the guys who are going to be there this year, looking ahead to 2013, obviously the Argos are the defending champions, but given the format, it's 18 games and 6 of the 18 make the playoffs. What are the things to really look for in the season ahead? What are the big storylines for you guys in Yahoo?
Well, I think the Argos are going to be a good team again. They're returning a lot of their key players. The thing that'll be really interesting to watch with them is their defensive line, though. Their defensive line was one of the main reasons they won the Grey Cup last year. It was so dominant, especially in that Grey Cup game where they completely shut down Calgary star running back John Cornish. And yet they've lost all of their defensive line starters, including Armin Armstead, who went to the NFL. So there are big shoes to fill there, and how well they do that is going to determine how well that team does this season. There's a lot of teams in the mix, though, and I think that may be the overarching storyline of this season. You've got a very, very good teams out west in BC and Calgary. Montreal is going to be a threat again. Hamilton is trying something different with head coach and general manager Kent Austin returning, and if the pieces click there, they could be in the mix. And obviously Saskatchewan, with them hosting the Grey Cup, they're under a lot of pressure to do well this year, and they've brought in some big-name veterans that might help them do so. I'd say it's a pretty wide open league. Often, I mean, at the moment, I'd say Winnipeg and Edmonton are the only two teams I wouldn't really think are in contention, but anything can happen in the CFL. And so I think it's going to be a great season and probably a pretty surprising one.
And so for people who are like trying to follow the league during the year, obviously you guys provide a great service, 55-yard line. That's largely where I sort of started picking it up, like myself personally. Who else is really sort of good to follow? Obviously, there's the regular papers online and TSN and the likes, but are there any other good blogs out there that you'd read?
Most of the blogs I read are the newspaper ones because there aren't a lot of fans doing a lot of blogging. However, there are a couple. One I do recommend is Brian from bclionsden.ca. He's a Lions fan who does a good bit of work there. And from the media side, there are a couple of really fantastic people out there. Herb Zurkowski from the Montreal Gazette is probably my favorite. He's been covering that team forever, and he knows just about everything there is to know about them. Toronto has a lot of really good people covering that team, especially I really like the work of Sean Fitzgerald from the National Post. And there's lots of really good people around the league. Rob Fenstone in Regina, Chris O'Leary and Terry Jones out in Edmonton, and then Lowell Ulrich in BC. So I think really the easiest way to pick it up for people interested is find a team you're interested in, find out who the good beat writers are for that team, and then follow them, follow what they're doing both in the paper and on their own beat blogs, because there's usually some really interesting stories there.
I suppose because like the classic skepticism I always get from players who I've played with in the league over here, which is the NCAA rules, is sort of they find the 2-and-out format a bit frustrating. Mm-hmm. People skeptical of that, like, you know, what would you say to try and convince them to try and give it a go, or to, I suppose, to enjoy the technical side of the game, or what would you say?
Well, I mean, what I say about that is, yeah, like, it sounds restraining. It sounds like there's going to be a lot of punting. Sometimes there is. You do get the occasional defensive game. But on the whole, the CFL tends to be higher scoring than the NFL, and higher scoring than even some college games. There's a lot of good offense that happens in this league, and you can still make some pretty impressive things happen even when you only have two downs. In some ways, it puts a little more. It puts more focus on the passing game, which is interesting, and it means that you can see some spectacular plays there. It means that when there is a run, usually it's going to be a big, exciting run, not just plunging for 3 yards. So, but in my mind, it's a pretty compelling product. Perhaps the best thing from a viewer's standpoint is how the clock rules change when you come down towards the end of the game. It is very difficult to kill the clock when you have a lead in the CFL, just because the clock doesn't keep running quite the same way it does in the NFL. So a lot of games are decided in the last 3 minutes, and you have a lot of teams coming from behind to win. To me, that makes for a pretty spectacular viewership experience.
I suppose one last thing I want to ask you about is the coverage the CFL is going to be getting in America this year, because I know in Ireland we regularly get on ESPN America, but that's been a long time thing, going back to the old NASN days, an old network that used to be over here. It's going to be on ESPN and on NBC Sports Network. What do you think was the motivation behind that? Is that going to help get interest in the league, or is there any other stuff behind that, do you think?
Well, what's really behind it from the CFL standpoint is something that's sort of unique in terms of leagues striking TV deals. The CFL's primary focus with its U.S. media deals isn't about getting the most money from providers, from the networks, and it's not about getting the most average fans to it. Both of those things, if they happened, are nice, but they're not the goal. The goal really is to promote their game to interested future players. themselves on the radar as an option where people who don't make the NFL can go and play a high level of football. And it's also to keep their current players happy, because the current guys, most of them, their families stay behind in the U.S. during the season. They've got all their friends that they grew up with who are trying to follow them, and if they can tell them, hey, I'm going to be playing on NBC Sports Network this Friday, that's good for the players. It makes them happier, makes them feel in contact with their families and their friends, and that can be quite a big deal from perspective of keeping these guys happy and keeping them wanting to stay in the CFL.
And well, if they've got any friends who emigrate to Ireland, they can watch it plenty too. Andrew, listen, thanks a lot for joining us, and really good insight into the CFL, especially for a lot of our regular site visitors who aren't too familiar with it. You can read Andrew's work regularly at 55 Yard Line blog on Yahoo, and follow him at Andrew Bucholtz on Twitter.